there, Araminta from the Cwicly team. In this video, we will be creating a back to top button from scratch in the Gutenberg editor with Cwicly. A back to top button is basically a shortcut button allowing users to swiftly be brought back to the top of a long page to avoid having to scroll the whole way up by themselves. It's an essential feature that any lengthy website should have. In Cwicly, setting up a back to top button is effortless, since it is a link action that can be applied to any block that supports links. Let's jump right in. Here we are in the Gutenberg editor. As you can guess, we will be adding a back to top button to this layout. As you can see, if we scroll to the bottom, I have already added the structure that will constitute our back to top button, which is simply a div containing a 20 pixel arrow icon block with a simple hover effect. If you want to follow along this video while building at the same time, in the description you will find an export file containing exactly this div pre-made for you so that you can start at the same starting point than me. First, I will start by naming this div back to top in the navigator panel so that I can visually see it better in the navigator. Before we add the back to top link, let's first set this button as fixed, which means that the element doesn't get affected by scrolling and remains, as its name indicates, in a fixed position in relation to the user's viewport/browser window. Let's do this by heading to the Advanced tab and Layout panel. In the Position dropdown, select Fixed. Traditionally, back to top buttons are placed on the right-hand bottom corner for user comfortability, so we can position our button 30 pixels from the right and 30 pixels from the bottom. As you can see, we don't set it 0 pixels from the right and bottom, because that would mean that it would be positioned exactly in the corner without any spacing between the browser's window and the button, which renders it inaccessible. Now we can set up the link that will make this button go back to top. Heading back to the Primary tab and toggling the link wrapper, we can remember to activate it, set the type to action, and select Scroll to Top. As you can see, it's very easy to set up. Before we delve into the other settings we can give this button, let's just check out the front end. As you can see, if I scroll down a little further, with a click, our button brings us back to the top of the page. This is great, but maybe we want this button to appear after scrolling from the top, or when we scroll past a certain block, which are all possibilities that we will explore in a moment. Before we do though, when I scroll past my testimonials element, my button disappears behind it. This is the perfect example to show you the importance of setting a z-index to blocks. The z-index is a CSS property which defines the hierarchy of elements and their overlapping. So if a block has a high z-index, it will be placed on top of elements with a lower one. So in this example, we will need to give our button a high z-index value for it to be placed on top of this testimonials element. Now we can head back to the editor and head to the Layout panel and set a 10,000 z-index. We are setting an incredibly high value, but that is simply to ensure that no other block can possibly be placed on top of it. Now let's focus again on our button. We will be setting properties that define when our button appears after scrolling, which means that our button must not be visible until the isVisible class is applied by Cwicly. By default, Cwicly adds the isVisible class when conditions are fulfilled / whatever is selected is targeted. So we need to hide our button for it to then become visible when the scrolling property is targeted. So let's hide this button. In the Layout panel, we can toggle the hidden property. In the Effects panel, we can also bring up opacity right down to 0, which will allow us to have a smooth apparition effect when our button is visible. To make this button visible when targeted, we will be using relative styling, which allows you to target the style of children blocks from the parent block and modify their styles from said parent's editor panel. We can select the plus symbol to add a relative style. We can now edit it. Let's give it a familiar name, such as visibility. We can leave the combinator to same set the selector type to class, and add the isVisible class. In the layout panel, we can toggle the visible property and head to the effects panel and bring our opacity right back up to 1. In this example, we are keeping things fairly simple, but you could jazz this button up by adding a transform to make it appear from the top, bottom, and so on. There are plenty of possibilities. Exiting out of the relative styling editor and heading back to our button's primary tab, we can add the isVisible class to our additional classes for the pure and simple reason that we can easily toggle on and off the class, which makes it visible or hidden, which is great for when we need to edit it. That being said, always remember to hide the class once you've finished editing. Now let's actually set up some scrolling targets. So let's open up once again our link settings and explore the different parameters. The target parameters target any selector, classes, IDs, etc., while the offset parameters allow you to set a pixel scrolling offset. It's also important to note that we can only set an out offset property if we have set an out target, while the in offset property doesn't, since it uses the user's window browser if there is no in target set. Let's first try out the in offset on its own, which is the most common. I will set a 300 pixel offset, because usually at 100 pixels and 200 pixels even, you can't usually tell that it's applied, since it's such a small offset from the window view on first loading. Let's see what it looks like on the front end. As you can see, on first loading the page, we can no longer see our button, and when we scroll down a little further, it smoothly appears. Now let's try another property. Let's say that we want our button to appear once we've reached the image in our hero section, but then for it to be gone once we reached the delightful black and white portrait of Jean-Philippe. So first, let's get our hero's image div's ID name and copy it. Back in the link settings, we can disable the 300 pixel offset we had previously set. In the in target field, we can type hash and then paste in our div's ID name. The in target basically means that the button will appear once the targeted selector appears in our browser window. The hash here is the selector, so for a class it would have been a dot. Before we set our out target property, let's just check this out first. As you can see, when our hero's image hits the top of our viewport, the button appears as intended. And as soon as the top of our viewport is above it, the button disappears. Here you can see how an offset could be useful so that the button appears slightly later than our block scrolls into view. It depends when and where you want your button to appear. And of course, you can set it with the offset properties. Finally, let's add our out target property, which means, as you can probably guess, that the button will disappear once the targeted selector disappears from our browser window. So let's select the portrait's ID name and copy it. In our link settings, we can paste it in without forgetting the hash, of course. Now let's see the result. As you can see, the in target still works since our button appears with our hero's image, and once we reach the bottom of our famous portrait, the button disappears as desired. Thank you for watching. I hope this tutorial was helpful in understanding how to build a back-to-top button completely from scratch in Gutenberg with Cwicly. As you can tell, building and setting up such a button is seamless and really quick. You also get to have a button that appears and disappears according to your exact wants and needs, which makes it all the more appropriate and useful when acting as a back-to-top button. If you have any questions or doubts, please don't hesitate to let us know down below. See you next time. Bye!